Hey guys, this is Wraith, author of the gay vampire romance Everdark that you are about to listen to, performed by a multi-actor cast. The podcast would not be possible without her Grace Reed studio, which provides the excellent voice talent, and of course, the support of the Wraith Rain members who are subscribers to my site, wraithrain.com, which you will learn about down below and in the podcast. I hope you enjoy how the talented actors bring these vampires and their world of darkness, mystery, and eternal love to life.
Chapter 1. Vampires are real. Julian had seen himself so many times in their videos that he could almost picture how he looked right at that moment. Dark hair closely cropped to his head, deep blue eyes that looked almost purple in certain lights, and a day's worth of stubble on cheekbones so sharp they could have cut glass. He was almost a carbon copy of his father, except that he had his mother's eyes. He knew that tonight he also looked more intense than usual. His lean, muscular body thrummed with barely concealed energy.
For those of you who are just finding our web series for the first time, my name is Julian Harrow.
Julian felt the weight of the Harrow name as he said it out loud. His parents had made it famous. He feared to make it infamous with the claims he'd be making tonight.
You might remember my parents, Jack and Joanna Harrow, from their old television show Believe. Or you might have read one of their many best-selling books on myths and monsters.
He paused for a long moment and then said,
You might also know that they died 16 years ago tonight.
Even speaking about their deaths, though he had done so many times to the police, to the media, to anyone who would listen, and few had, still hurt. His parents hadn't just died, they'd been murdered. No matter what the official report said, Julian knew the truth. The fact that he and Christian had discovered the location of the city of Pale Stone, the city that had gotten his parents killed, 16 years exactly to the day they had died, felt like fate. For a moment, Julian remembered the flashing of red and blue lights streaming through the Thorns' front bay windows when the police had come to give him the news. He had been having a sleepover with Christian that night. There had been popcorn and corny 1950s monster movies, to be followed by video games, but the police had been a different kind of excitement. It had never occurred to Julian when he'd seen the two solemn figures walking up the front path to Christian's house all those years ago that they could be there about his parents. His parents had been immortal in his mind. They could not die. Nothing could happen to them. They'd survived adventures in the deepest jungles and on the highest mountains. They had not even been leaving town that night. How could anything bad possibly happen to them in boring Ravenscross after all? But after the police had spoken to Christian's parents, Julian had seen the expressions on their faces. Tears ran down Elizabeth's cheeks. Grief filled Henry's eyes. They were as white as chalk with streaks of blue and red as the police cruiser's lights spun. Something terrible had happened. The police knew it, the Thorns knew it, and then Julian did too. His parents were not coming home, ever again. A lump now formed in Julian's throat as he remembered knowing that simple fact. It threatened to silence him and end the video before it had hardly begun, but he swallowed it down and went on.
But what you don't know, what's never been revealed before, is that my parents died because they had proof of the existence of vampires.
Christian's jaw tightened as Julian said this. This was a point of contention between them, a point that Christian had lost. Christian's logical mind only wanted him to say what they knew for certain. Anything else brought the veracity of the rest of their claims into question. Yet the facts that they did have led Julian at least to one simple conclusion. His parents had been murdered to keep the existence of vampires a secret. Officially, Julian's parents had died in a car accident. It had been a dark and rainy night. The roads had been slick as ice. His father had, allegedly, lost control of his car. His parents' vehicle had then veered off the road, smashed through the guardrail and sailed off the side of a cliff. where it had landed 500 feet below, crumpling like an accordion before bursting into flames. His parents' bodies had been incinerated. There had not been enough left of them to determine what had killed them. Were they killed by the crash, or, as Julian contended, before then? Unofficially, the story was much different. The timing of their deaths had never sat right with Julian. What were the odds that his parents would die just before they revealed to the world their proof that vampires existed? The state of their bodies, too, raised doubts. Again, they had been too damaged to determine the cause of death. But what was left of them had accidentally been cremated further afterwards, despite their express desires to be buried together in the Harrows family plot. So even if new technology could have come into existence that could have revealed something about their deaths, it wouldn't have mattered. They were ashes now. And then there was the fact that all of their research materials on what they had last been investigating had been stolen right after their deaths. Nothing was left for anyone to know what they had been so excited about or willing to risk so much for, except for the journals hidden in the attic. And it was one of these journals with the soft, worn brown covers that he held up to the camera as an exhibit. These journals had told him the truth, the insane truth.
2 years ago, I found my parents' journals hidden away where none of the thieves who took the rest of their research could find.
Julian swallowed deeply.
In these journals, my mother revealed what they'd been looking for just before they were killed. Not more than looking for, what they had found.
He opened the journal with hands that trembled, both with anticipation and anger. His parents had been stolen from him, and he would never forgive those who had done this. He read,
All throughout the years, we've heard rumors of them. The crazed whispering about beautiful people with silver eyes and a taste for blood. Disjointed words that painted pictures of shadowy figures flitting through darkened alleyways. The heartbroken statements from family members of people who have simply vanished. Some were found dead, drained of blood. Others were discovered, but they were changed. They had those same silver eyes and empty smiles. They were vampires.
Julian swallowed again before he continued reading from the journal.
But then we heard things that had nothing to do with the established mythology of vampires. Things so wild that they almost seemed more true. We heard that they have successfully stayed hidden from humans because they do not live on our Earth, but in another place. A place connected to our world through magical gates. This place is called the Everdark.
Julian paused in his reading so that the audience could let his words sink in. Forget stinking graves or rotting coffins. Vampires lived in a whole other world with great cities of pale stone. He paged through the journal until he found the next entry he wanted to read. He licked his lips and continued to read his mother's shocking words.
We found the symbol to unlock the way into one of their cities today. Jack is convinced that these passages are somehow controlled Einstein-Rosen bridges, but I don't know how wormholes could safely be created on Earth, let alone directed to a single city on another planet. But no matter what they are or how they work, the gate took us to another world. We found it. We found the Everdark, the world of vampires, and we cannot wait to share our discovery with humanity.
Julian closed the journal. His hands were still shaking. He lost focus on the camera for a moment, overwhelmed by the fact that this was what had signed his parents' death warrants. This desire to share with humanity that they were not alone, that vampires existed right alongside everyone. His parents had not feared these beings. They had been awed, but they should have been careful. They should have been more afraid.
They never got to share this discovery, because right after my mother wrote this, she and my father were killed. It was no accident. It was no coincidence.
He lifted his head to once more look into the camera's lens.
They were stopped from revealing this great discovery. But I won't be.
Julian thought.
We're here to carry on my parents' work. I keep saying we, but for our newcomers, I haven't yet introduced you to the Scully to my Mulder, who's the wielder of the camera and a highly logical mind, Christian Thorne.
Julian flashed a genuine smile as Christian turned the camera towards the mirror that was on the right-hand wall, so the audience could see him in the reflection.
He's the one that keeps me on the straight and narrow.
Julian's best friend was almost his exact opposite in looks, light to his dark. Christian was blonde, with piercing blue eyes and a pink mouth that looked like he was continually pouting, though Christian had never pouted in his life. He had creamy, pale gold skin that immediately burned when he stepped out in sunlight. His features were masculine yet delicate. He would have been loved by ancient Greek sculptors.
Personally,
Christian said in a crisp voice,
I like to think of myself as the Spock to Julian's Kirk. Scully was always getting conveniently knocked out and simply missing all the alien action, while Spock was well aware of what was going on. He just wanted Kirk to look at the facts and not be ruled by his emotions. Facts, not emotions. But you, my friend, inspire plenty of emotions.
Every time his camera-shy best friend went on film, the amount of comments, emails, and other social media mentions they got from admirers went through the roof. There was even some fan fiction about them both. Christian abhorred the attention. Who he was had nothing to do with how he looked. And after the terrible experience with David, Christian would never open his heart again. The only people he allowed himself to care for were Julian and his parents, Doctors Henry and Elizabeth Thorne. Christian turned the camera back on Julian. Now was the time to get to the good stuff.
Why, you might be wondering, if we've had my parents' journals for 2 years, haven't Christian and I gone to the Everdark?
He held up the journal.
Well, my parents were clever. Really clever. And they hid the location to one of these gates to the Everdark in a code that we couldn't decipher until tonight.
It was slightly theatrical. Okay, the whole presentation was highly theatrical, and he saw Christian giving him a raised eyebrow about it, but Julian was playing to their audience. Unlike most people, Julian's heart did not thrill at the thought of vampires, at least not in the way that most people's did.
They're predators, and I'm going to expose them to the world so they can't hide and hurt anyone else.
He silently promised himself. So the more people he intrigued with their videos, whatever their reasons for wanting vampires to be real, the better.
We're filming this here, in my father's study, rather than on location, because of the danger we will be in the moment we get to the gate.
Julian gestured to the room. Christian slowly panned around the space, highlighting the bookcases stuffed with thick leather volumes, delicate scrolls, and reprints of ancient texts his parents had used in their research into the paranormal. He finally stopped on Julian once more.
We'll be going to the location tonight. We will be going to the Everdark,
he said, and his voice shook with emotion.
But when we do, like my parents, we might not come back. So we're filming this intro and uploading it to the server along with scanned copies of my parents' journals and the location of the gate. This video and those materials will be posted tomorrow night, whether we return or not. Now, once again, for those of you unfamiliar with our work, let me tell you what we're not going to do tonight.
Julian's voice was firm.
We're not going to run around in the dark with cameras showing only our faces, looking scared and breathing heavily as we ask, "What was that?" about normal sounds of buildings settling, traffic whizzing, or crickets.
Julian allowed his expression to show the disdain he felt for the many, many haunted places shows that never actually showed any paranormal occurrence, let alone ghosts. Those shows went to creepy places, turned off the lights, if there were any, and filmed the actors more than the actual locations. His parents had never resorted to such gimmickry in their television programs. If they had not been able to film what they were researching, whether it was Atlantis, the abominable snowman, or the Jersey Devil, they'd explain the actual history of the alleged myth. They would speak to scholars and the knowledgeable elders in the area. They would write up what they learned for scholarly magazines, which often wouldn't accept their papers because of the subject matter. But they kept trying. They treated these things respectfully, and they were right to.
You're going to see what we see. No editing, no filters. Just the raw footage. Tonight changes everything.
He stared deeply into the camera as if he were looking into the viewer's eyes.
The next time we speak to you, we will be able to prove that vampires are real. And that's a cut.
Christian stopped the video recorder and popped out the small memory card.
Yeah, it is. Can I have the memory card? I want to upload the video to the site right this instant.
Julian extended his hand. It was finally steady. As soon as they had decoded the city's location, he'd wanted to go there, but he'd forced himself to make this video first. They needed a record.
You're really going to post this? Before we're even sure there's anything there?
Christian kept the card in his hand.
Don't worry. I really will be setting the video to go live tomorrow, unless we come back and change it.
Julian wiggled his fingers expectantly.
In case we don't make it back, right?
Christian's eyebrows rose, and a slight smile twitched his lips. He clearly thought Julian was being melodramatic. Julian disagreed and gave no answering smile.
Exactly. If we don't make it back. We've gone halfway around the world to look for proof of the Yeti, yet she didn't have us upload any footage then.
Christian pointed out.
A Yeti didn't kill my parents.
Julian responded dryly. Christian opened his mouth to make his usual argument that vampires didn't kill Julian's parents either. That, other than the Harrow's journals, there was no proof that vampires existed. There were enough killers in the human population alone to account for all the terrible things that happened without adding immortal, blood-sucking beings to the mix. And Julian might have agreed with him, but the journals told him differently. His parents did not lie, so he believed what he'd read, no matter what logical arguments Christian put out there. Christian, though, did not argue this time. He merely said,
You know, I'd prefer us to wait to post anything until we're certain. I know. And if you're right, we'll be back tonight in plenty of time to stop the video from running.
Julian answered.
But if you're wrong...
With a sigh, Christian handed the memory card to him. Julian went over to the computer and inserted it into the slot. He typed in the login and password for their website and uploaded the video to the server. The only sound in the room were Julian's fingers tapping on the keyboard. When he stopped typing, the silence seemed thick.
Well, what'd you think of the intro?
Julian asked, without turning around to face his best friend.
It was fine.
Christian's voice was dry and clipped. Not a good sign. He heard a snap as Christian folded the screen closed on the video recorder. There was the rip of Velcro as Christian fastened it into the handmade carrying case on his hip, before going over to the chair where both of their backpacks sat. Inside the packs were lengths of rope, flashlights, extra batteries, first aid kits, pads of paper for taking notes or etchings, water, and freeze-dried packets of food in the main compartment. Christian was always prepared. His best friend had only once not thought of every possibility. That would never happen again.
You don't sound exactly enthusiastic.
Julian pointed out.
I'll get excited if we find anything beneath the old library except moldering periodicals.
Christian answered. Julian grabbed his own backpack off of the chair. The smell of his father's cologne suddenly rose up all around him. He froze as a memory of Jack Harrow sitting there, holding his arms open for a young Julian to climb into his lap, came back to him with poignant clarity. He pushed the image away as he pulled the straps of his backpack over his shoulders. His mother's journal with the explanation of what symbol to place on the wall went into the front pocket of his pants.
We've been working to find this city since we discovered Mom and Dad's journals. Now you're regretting it?
Julian pressed.
Who says that I'm regretting anything?
But Christian's tone was tense, belying his words. This had to be something feeling-based, which explained Christian's curtness. His best friend hated emotions, and he wasn't very good at dealing with them. Julian turned around to face Christian. His best friend was holding his own backpack with white-knuckled hands in front of him as if it were a shield, and Julian was about to lob missiles at him. Christian's muscles were hard and tight under Julian's fingers when he put his hand on his best friend's shoulder.
He's really upset. Tell me what's bothering you.
Julian said gently.
We're on the cusp of discovering vampires exist. Or, more likely, that they don't exist.
Christian looked at him almost sadly. He went back to arranging his bag, not quite meeting Julian's eyes. Julian's brow furrowed.
We've had this argument for years. We'll find out who is right after tonight. Nothing you can say will change my mind about going there. Or yours either, I might add. You know that. So what's really going on? I'm worried about you,
Christian answered as he checked the clip-on flashlight's batteries.
Ah, here we go. Why are you worrying about me?
Julian probed. Christian stopped fussing with his backpack and looked into Julian's eyes.
I know how much you need answers about what happened to your parents. I know that you need their deaths to be something more meaningful than just a car accident.
Julian's throat closed up again. He did need that to be the case, but just because he needed it didn't mean that it couldn't also be true.
Yeah, I do.
Julian admitted.
And we've argued back and forth since we found the journals, whether what they wrote about is connected to their deaths. We can't convince each other. You don't believe in vampires, but I do. Just come with me tonight. I'm coming. Of course I'm coming with you.
Christian ran a hand through his thick blonde hair.
I'd go anywhere with you, Julian. What? If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. Nothing happens to me. My heart doesn't shatter.
These were romantic words from Christian, but Julian knew that Christian hid behind logic because he felt too much.
But if you're wrong, then I'm wrong.
Julian cut him off. A faint tremor ran through him, but he thought he hid it well, though the look of disbelief in Christian's eyes told him he might not have hid it well enough.
We're going to the city, Christian, so you can't protect me from what's going to happen. I'm going to find out the truth, no matter what it is.
Christian let out a sigh.
You are so goddamn stubborn. That's hardly new.
Julian gave him a crooked smile.
I just want to prepare you,
Christian murmured as he pulled the backpack on. Julian squeezed Christian's shoulder one last time.
I am as prepared as I'm ever going to be. Let's go. Let's find out the truth.
Hey guys, it's Wraith here. For those of you who don't know me, I am the author of Everdark, and I just want to check in with you. I hope you are loving this full cast recording of Everdark as much as I am. I've been planning this for months, and it's all thanks to everyone who has supported me since 2010 that we're able to do this. Without you, I could not be here sharing this today. I know that some of you might miss my voice acting from Dragon's Reign. Don't worry, I'm still here behind the scenes, and you'll in fact hear from me and the cast every week because we've recorded some studio discussions that gives you an inside look into the making of the Everdark podcast. And, of course, there's nothing to stop me from reading more of my stories, but having Her Grace Read Studio produce Everdark is a dream come true for me. As with every episode, I love to hear what you think. So for those of you already on the YouTube channel, leave your comments in the comments section. And I hope that everyone else who's listening us on Spotify and iHeartRadio will come on over and check us out there too. We're so looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Balthazar.
Vampire confessor Arceus Kane joined the vampire lord of House Ravenscroft out on the expansive balcony. They could almost see Wingate from where they were.
What is so interesting about that infernal mortal device?
Arceus, your presence is quite welcome, but your commentary on technology is not. Lord Balthazar Ravenscroft said, without looking up from the tablet he held in his slender, long-fingered hands. He was watching the as-yet unreleased video from Julian Harrow and Christian Thorne on location in the Harrows' old home of Wingate. Having had one of his fledglings hack their website to give him unrestricted access to their server was paying dividends. His full lips were lifted into a large smile.
You aren't watching those boys again, are you? Haven't you grown tired of their snipe hunts? Or is the blonde one with the pouty lips obsessing you again?
Arceus grinned as he sauntered over. Butter wouldn't melt in the lovely Christian's mouth, but he does intrigue me. And for more reasons than simply his beauty, Balthazar said, almost primly. He didn't deny that he had hungers. Christian Thorne aroused him like few others, but that might have only been because he told himself that he could not have the blonde beauty. If he could have slaked his hunger for him by taking Christian's body as well as his blood, he likely would have forgotten him by now. Or, at least, that was what he told himself. He'd been tempted again and again to simply use his Eiros bloodline gift and have the young man before erasing the memory of their encounter from his mind. But, perversely, He wanted Christian to remember him. He wanted to burn the memory of himself on Christian's mind. So he stayed away. Arceus chuckled indulgently and broke Balthazar out of his thoughts by saying,
You are a slave to Christian's beauty.
I am a slave to no one. That is why I was exiled after killing my master. Speaking of killing his master, Roan Tithe never displeased him. But his exile from the Everdark did. There was no way to grow his house's power unless he had access to the world where the first immortals came from. As it was, even today, vampires had only limited access to certain of the Everdark's holdings, a fraction of what was rumored to be there. Balthazar leaned his aristocratic face back to bathe it under the young October moon. As he did so, he caught sight of his reflection in the French door's glass panels. His dark brown hair fell in loose waves to his chin. The moonlight brought out the hints of copper in his locks. He'd had green eyes when he'd been mortal, but now he had the silver eyes that all vampires shared, no matter what their bloodline or house. His olive-toned skin made him look tan, despite him not having been in the sun for over 200 years. He was tall for the age he'd come from, just over 6 feet. His body, like most vampires, was corded with muscle and had little fat content. His appearance pleased him, and likely would please Christian if he ever revealed himself to the young man. Not that it would have mattered if he was ugly as sin. Being of the Eiros bloodline meant he could control minds, but he also had a powerful subclass of that gift which allowed him to become the object of fantasies of anyone he wished. His kind were called seducers, and most other vampires ironically loathed them, because love really was the most powerful thing one could control. Mine is the best gift of all, though the Ashir bloodline's gift of telekinesis would be useful. Or even the Seer bloodline's gift of seeing the future would be a kick, though it would make things boring. There were 10 vampire bloodlines founded by the 10 original vampires, or immortals, as they were known in the vampires' religion. These immortals had never been humans, but had come from the Everdark to Earth. Whoever these immortals had changed into vampires gained that specific gift the immortal had, in addition to eternal youth and the taste for blood, and they passed both down to their fledglings. There was supposedly an 11th immortal, a first among equals, a king, who had all the other immortals' powers, plus another one referred to simply as Armageddon. But he was a myth, and the others might as well have been too. They'd been given their second deaths long ago, if they'd ever existed. Though really having all the powers would be quite the thing. Balthazar rubbed the tattoo of 2 interlocking silver rings on the inside of his right wrist. This was the symbol of the Eiros bloodline. It appeared on the skin of every vampire of that bloodline. Each bloodline had its own symbol. The symbol for the 11th immortal's unnamed bloodline was an infinity symbol. And no vampire has ever had one of those, because this 11th bloodline is a myth. Even vampires have myths, it seems. We too need to believe in something greater than ourselves.
I did not mean to make you think of Rowan.
Arceus said after studying Balthazar's face.
I am sorry.
The memory of Rowan is not what is making me cross, and you, of all people, have the right to bring him up to me, Balthazar said with a small smile. You left the Order, chose exile, and that spared my life.
The proudest moment of my second life.
Arceus leaned against the stone railing of the balcony. He had shoulder-length, dark brown wavy hair and a full beard barely brushed with frost. His heavily muscled body made him look like one of those berserkers that Balthazar remembered from his human life. But Arceus had chosen to be the equivalent of a priest in his second life, though that did not mean he abstained from fighting or killing. Quite the opposite. I hope you haven't grown too attached to being an exile and living only on Earth, Arceus, for I might have a way for us to get back into the Everdark, Balthazar drawled. a mischievous light in his silver eyes. Arceus turned his bear-like body towards Balthazar with one raised eyebrow.
Do not tell me that the boys have found the supposed abandoned vampire city.
Balthazar nodded. I think they have. Imagine the accolades we will gain from bringing access to a heretofore lost city in the Everdark to vampire kind.
But Caemon ordered the Harrow's deaths. If there really was a city, he would have obtained the information from the Harrows before killing them.
Arceus pointed out.
He is no fool.
Caemon was vampire preceptor Caemon Losus, leader of the Order, and all-around bastard. He had gleefully exiled Balthazar and all who took his side. He was as vicious as a viper and a zealot, but as Arceus had said, he was no fool. You would think so. Balthazar smoothed down the front of his pale green silk shirt. But then again, he's more comfortable with the dead than the living, considering his Kali blood. The Kali bloodline's gift was necromancy. Those of the Kali rarely joined the Order, because they had little interest in living things, preferring to work with the dead. But over 1,000 years ago, Caemon had left his house and joined the Order, rising to the highest rank within just 500 years.
Do not be racist, Balthazar. He did not kill the Harrows to have access to their bodies. He must have thought there was a real threat.
Arceus murmured as he stroked his thick beard. Humans have discovered our existence many times before, and we've dealt with them without resorting to killing. Balthazar shook his head. The Harrows were such public figures, too. Their son is of their metal, and more so, I think. Caemon made a mistake. While Christian Thorn was more to the taste of his loins, Julian Harrow had a certain something that made him think that the young man would be an excellent addition as a vampire. He'd had a fantasy of taking both young men as his own fledglings. Maybe the time had come for that.
What could have made Caemon so desperate, I wonder?
Arceus wondered.
Another Everdark city would be a boon, unless... Could it be that this city is special in some way?
Special how? But Arceus merely shook his head. He had no answers yet, but they would get them. I've sent Heath and Celine to follow Julian and Christian. Balthazar's silver eyes gleamed. Whatever those young men find, we will find it too. Everdark, Episode 2. Following Footsteps.
I think we're being followed.
Julian muttered as they jogged up the smooth marble steps of the library.
No one knows we decoded the journals today, Julian. Why would someone suddenly be following us to the library of all places? Wouldn't they just think we're here to do research?
Christian made a move to turn around to study their surroundings, but Julian caught his arm.
Don't turn around.
Julian hissed.
They'll see you.
Christian's eyebrows rose up, as did the hair on the back of his neck. Now that his best friend had mentioned it, he did feel eyes on them. It was reminiscent of the feelings he'd had when they were in Mumbai, when a gang of street thugs had believed he and Julian were easy marks. His right hand went to his video recorder. That was the most precious object he had on him, but his forehead furrowed. His objection to being followed still stood. No one knew that they had discovered the alleged location to the vampire city, so why would someone be tracking them on this night of all nights?
Unless they hacked our server, but how likely is that? But even our most rabid fans wouldn't go to that extent. And we've never publicly talked about vampires until tonight, so it couldn't be them. Well, it couldn't be vampires anyway, since they aren't real.
He added that last part automatically. He respected Julian. He respected Julian's parents. But he was having a lot of difficulty believing in blood-drinking immortals that could pass between universes. If not for reading the Harrow's hidden journals, he would never have thought such a thing possible outside of fiction. He still didn't believe it was possible. From what the Harrows had written, they had started on this track of inquiry because of a fan they'd met in Budapest. This fan had a former girlfriend, a doctor who was something called an acolyte of a vampire house. Acolytes were humans who had been given tastes of a vampire's blood that granted benefits like increased strength, speed, mental acuity and extended youthfulness for as long as the blood-drinking continued. Acolytes were people the vampires had determined would be useful to have access to in this universe. Doctors, lawyers, politicians, business owners, and the like were often chosen for these positions. Some were turned into vampires, but many were not, because they lost their usefulness once they were turned. Just like in the legends, vampires could not walk in daylight, which made certain occupations difficult at best. This fan told the Harrows that her former girlfriend had wanted desperately to be a vampire, but the house had decided not to turn her, and had cut her off from her sips of vampire blood. This had reduced the woman to a homeless wreck. She was like a junkie that could never get a fix. The fan was desperate to help her former lover, and hoped the Harrows might assist her. Maybe in some of their adventures they had run across the vampires or other acolytes that had successfully kicked the blood addiction. The Harrows had agreed to try and help, but after one poignant encounter with the former acolyte, in which she mostly raged about the fan's betrayal of secrets, the former acolyte had been found dead, apparently of suicide in the Danube. But the Harrows didn't believe in coincidences like this any more than Julian did. She had talked to them about vampires, and now she was dead. They tracked down other acolytes, both ones that had been cut loose and others that were still in active service. From them they'd learned all about the vampires and the alternate universe. They'd even gotten a vampire religious text, one of the things missing from Wingate after their deaths, which had led them to the cavern below the library and the abandoned vampire city. Christian wondered at the vampire's security. If these acolytes would just reveal their deepest secrets and hand over sacred texts, but then again, the Harrows weren't just anyone, and not all the acolytes were happy to be in service. Some were simply trapped. Their lives were no longer their own. Some saw themselves as slaves. From their reflections in the journals, it was clear that the Harrows were fascinated with what they were discovering, but they were also just as determined to free those unwilling acolytes by bringing the vampire's existence to the world. Christian wondered even if everything that the Harrows and Julian believed was real about vampires, if revealing that truth would actually accomplish the good that they thought it would. Or would it trigger the vampires to preemptively strike at humanity? With the supposed powers they had, and the acolytes they'd gathered, wouldn't the more likely outcome be that the information was suppressed, at best, or at worst, the vampires rising up and taking their place as rulers of Earth? Since he didn't think it was likely that the Harrows were lying in their journals, and it seemed hugely unlikely that every person they met was lying too, Christian thought that there might be some kind of underground religion. Drugs could easily be administered to people without their knowledge. That could cause the addiction and dependence that those acolytes felt. It could all be explained away. But he still had the prickling feeling on the back of his neck. Despite what his logical brain was telling him about vampires not existing, and even if they did, no one knew what Julian and his plans were that night. The sense that something wasn't right remained. The human brain took in far more information that was consciously processed. His subconscious was letting him know that he'd observed something off. He just didn't know what it was. He lowered his head and gave a quick scan of the line of cars along the curb outside of the library. He thought he caught sight of a shadow passing between two of them, but when he focused in on it, there was nothing there. Yet he couldn't be sure that nothing had been there. It was full dark out, and the streetlights were dim. The street lamps were meant to look like old-fashioned gas lamps with the uncertain flickering light of gas as well. They were pretty to look at, but didn't do a very good job at lighting up the place. Still, their town was hardly a haven for criminals, so adequate lighting wasn't a concern. One was more likely to bump into a professor from the local university walking her dog than a thug. His own parents were professors there. He glanced up at Julian. His best friend's eyes were scanning the pockets of darkness. A frown was on his handsome face. Julian's thumbs were hooked behind the straps of his backpack, as if ready to slip it off and take off after someone at a moment's notice. But then Julian's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he shook his head.
I could have sworn that someone was behind us, but there's no one. I thought I saw someone myself after you mentioned it.
Christian kept his voice low.
Maybe you weren't imagining things. Maybe they're just very good at hiding.
The night seemed terribly quiet then. There was not even the chirr of night insects or the rustle of tree limbs in the cool October breeze. They stood there, still and listening for a few more minutes.
Let's go in. I don't think we'll see anything more, and the library closes in an hour.
Julian said and turned towards the doors.
So, we only have an hour to find the vampire city and get out?
Christian frowned.
Of course not. But I figured an hour would give poor Mrs. McArdle time to forget we came in before the old dear locks up for the night.
Julian flashed him one of his trademarked smiles that had their fans squealing in delight and fantasizing about him being their boyfriend.
Right.
Mrs. McArdle had been old when they were kids. She'd been old when his parents had moved to town. And she was still old and still running the library 7 days a week, rain or shine, in sickness or in health.
Maybe she's a vampire. Sweet old librarian equals cleverest vampire disguise yet.
But he'd seen Mrs. McArdle in daylight, and he doubted that even the vampires would consider an elderly librarian a worthy acolyte.
But then again, she is working on top of an entrance to one of their cities.
Christian shook himself internally. Was he really thinking that their librarian was an acolyte who had ratted out the Harrows to her masters who had then killed them? No, he could not believe it. Yet as he passed inside the library, the prickling on the back of his neck was back. He didn't turn around, but made sure the heavy bronze door to the library closed firmly behind him. The smell of yellowing paper and lavender perfume engulfed Christian. It was a smell he loved. It was the scent of old books and the elderly librarian who had been their guardian for who knew how long. The heavy bronze front doors of the library opened into a circular rotunda. The library was 3 stories tall, and the rotunda was overlooked by every floor. The gold-painted dome ceiling glowed softly in the library's welcoming yellow lights. In the center of the rotunda sat Mrs. McArdle in a desk as round as the room. Despite being a fixture at the library forever, Mrs. McArdle, no one knew if there was a Mr., and no one was brave enough to ask, was not one to remain in the past. That wasn't exactly true. She believed if something was not broken, then it was better not to fix it, but she'd embraced technology like a person brought up with it. She had gotten grants and donations in order to have top-of-the-line computers installed at the library for the patrons' use. She had immediately subscribed to the digital world of books, and patrons were able to borrow electronically as easily as they could borrow physical books. She brought in experts to give talks on every subject under the sun, which had patrons coming to the library eagerly. There were 3 book groups that met at the library on different nights of the week. A wine aficionados club had wine and cheese parties at least once a month in the second-floor reading room. She made sure that people who needed help to find jobs not only got access to the library's computers and printers, but also had hiring firms on call who gave free classes on resumes and cover letters, not to mention looking at patrons' skills to see if they had any work for them. Christian's parents believed the woman to be a saint, and though Christian knew that every person was flawed in some way, he had to agree with his parents that Mrs. McArdle had brought more light than dark into the world. Where in other towns libraries were dying, theirs was vibrant. Even though it was past 9 o'clock on a Thursday, there were plenty of patrons in the library. Maybe he and Julian would be able to slip past Mrs. McArdle and she wouldn't notice.
Julian, Christian, it's so good to see you,
The librarian called out. Mrs. McArdle turned away from the blue glow of her computer's large flat-screen monitor to gaze benevolently at them over half-moon glasses. She had short, white hair like a wiry bristle brush, hazel eyes, and a bird-like face.
Mrs. McArdle,
Julian said smoothly, as if he hadn't hoped the same thing that Christian had, which was to stay out of her radar. He walked over to the round desk with Christian tagging behind him.
Hey, keeping busy, I see.
always.
She tipped her head towards Christian's video camera.
You aren't here to do a special on ghosts in the library for your website, are you?
Depends.
Julian grinned and leaned on top of the desk on his forearms. He dropped his voice conspiratorially as he asked,
Are there any ghosts in the library?
She leaned forward with a twinkle in her hazel eyes.
Depends on if you count the ghostly finds.
Julian laughed.
I think our viewers might be interested in that.
Mrs. McArdle, I didn't know you watched our series.
Christian said, a slight tingle of unease running through him.
I don't miss an episode. You're two hometown boys who have done extremely well.
She responded proudly.
I watched your parents' show, Julian, and I can tell you they would be just thrilled with what you and Christian are doing.
Julian ducked his head and smiled shyly, thanking the librarian for her kind words. Though he doubted Mrs. McArdle saw it, Christian noticed the slight tenseness that went through Julian at any mention of his parents. Their deaths were still an open wound despite the long years that had passed. The wounds had only gaped larger since they had found the journals. Julian's unformed feelings of something being wrong had become certainties regarding his parents' death, and he had begun to obsess. Christian ached for him. Getting Julian some kind of closure, even if it wasn't the unmasking of paranormal entities, had become Christian's goal in life. Now that the moment was nearly upon him, though, he wondered if he shouldn't have discouraged Julian from this course. It would just lead to unhappiness when they didn't find any city of pale stone.
So, is there anything that the library can do for you?
Mrs. McArdle folded her hands primly in front of her, looking alert and eager to help.
Oh, no, we're just gonna pull out some of the reference books on Tibet.
Julian lied, though the reference section was near the basement door. A man was approaching, arms laden with books, while a little girl marched beside him, telling her father that they had to read at least half the books that night before she went to bed. Christian smiled. He had always loved books himself, and it was a great dad that would allow his little girl to stay up late reading them.
We won't keep you, Mrs. McArdle,
Christian said, tilting his head towards the father and daughter team. She smiled warmly.
I can't wait to see the next episode, boys.
They smiled and nodded back at her before heading towards the reference section.
Everdark is a completed written story that's 147 chapters long. It was originally published on my own serial website, wraithrain.com. Since 2010, I've run my own serial site for gay, romantic, epic-length stories. At any time, I have 4 stories ongoing in high fantasy, vampire, crime lord, you name it. There's always something new happening on Wraith Rain. If you want to check out what I'm doing now, click on the link in the notes below.
You do realize that when we post the video about the vampire city being under the library, that she'll be the first one down there to check it out?
Christian asked under his breath.
I know she will. That's what I'm hoping for. The more people who know, the better.
Julian answered and hastened his pace. The door to the basement was made of heavy, dark wood and had a cherry-red fire extinguisher beside it. It hardly looked like the portal to a vampire city. It was locked, however. Not that this was any deterrent to them. Picking locks was just one of the tricks they'd learned as they'd traveled the world. Christian stood guard, blocking people's view of Julian as his best friend got down on one knee and used his lockpicks to open the ancient door. The reference section was, thankfully, mostly empty, except for a teenage girl and boy who were more interested in looking deeply into each other's eyes than at the books, lying open and untouched on the table between them. The boy had given Christian and Julian the stink eye as soon as they'd come into the reference section. Clearly, he and the girl had been hoping for some alone time in the quiet nook. Christian was just glad that they were ignoring him and Julian now.
Got it?
Christian asked out of the corner of his mouth. The door was situated in such a way that if someone rounded the first row of stacks, they would see him and Julian. Christian shifted from foot to foot as Julian lifted tumblers.
Almost there. Hold on. Ugh. Got it.
Julian let out a soft sound of success and rose up to a standing position.
Was that lock more complicated than you expected?
Christian asked as he turned around to face the door and his best friend. Julian had his hand on the doorknob that was polished brightly from countless hands turning it.
Tumblers were a little stiff, to be honest. I just hope that Mrs. McArdle didn't invest in any fancy security system beyond this point.
We can only hope. Come on, let's go.
Christian gestured for Julian to open the door. For once, his best friend was hesitating, and Christian saw the mixture of hope and fear in Julian's blue eyes. He put a hand on his arm.
It'll be all right.
But did he mean that it would be all right if nothing was below them to be discovered? Or if there was? Julian, though, just nodded and turned the doorknob. The door to the basement opened with a soft creak. Cold, water-damp air raced out at them. Ahead of them was the start of a staircase leading down into the unknown. They didn't bother to look for a light switch. They just both turned on the clip-on flashlights that were attached to the straps of their backpacks. These gave out powerful beams. A simple staircase led down to a landing, and Christian caught sight of another flight heading further into darkness. Without a word to one another, they stepped inside and closed the door. Somewhere below them was the entrance to the Everdark and the city of pale stone. If Julian was right. Did he want for Julian to be right? There was no answer in his mind, but he forged ahead anyway.
There's no going back now.
Their footsteps on the stairs were just soft taps. Despite his belief that they would find nothing, or something far more explainable than a vampire city in the cavern below, Christian found that his heart was thudding heavily in his chest and his breathing was elevated. The bright, metallic taste of adrenaline filled his mouth. At the bottom of the first set of stairs, Julian pulled out his mother's journal, flipping to a marked page which he read carefully. Christian looked ahead of them and saw what appeared to be a maze of corridors snaking off in all directions from his main corridor.
Okay, I know where we're going. 3 rights and 1 left, and we'll get to the old door to the cavern,
Julian said, as he smartly closed the journal and slid it back into his cargo pants pocket.
Lay on, Macduff.
Julian flashed that grin again, though it had a nervous edge to it this time. The two of them practically flew down the corridors until they stopped in front of an aged metal door. The door was cold to the touch, and Christian removed his fingers from its surface like it had bitten him. He wiped them against his shirt, while Julian kneeled down to do some more picking. Julian muttered under his breath as he worked, which helped dispel some of the oppressive silence of the basement. Christian kept thinking that he heard stray footfalls behind them. The darkness pressed in on them from every side, yet it shouldn't have bothered him as much as it did. He was used to being in blackness with only their flashlights. He took comfort in the fact that he had more than enough batteries to last them for a week underground, and the food and water to go with it. Normally, that comfort was enough to push away humanity's simple atavistic fears of the darkness and the predators it might hide. But it wasn't working this time. Christian found himself constantly shining his flashlight down the corridors, hoping to catch sight of something. But if there was someone or something there, his light didn't reach far enough, and he found himself unwilling to venture away from Julian, because it seemed if he took one step away from Julian in one direction, a sense that something was coming towards them from the exact opposite direction would overcome him. He would not leave his friend unguarded. Christian did not try to convince himself this was just nerves. As he had realized before when they were outside, his subconscious mind was warning him of something being off, even if he didn't know what it was.
Yes, got it.
Julian crowed and stood. He looked at Christian in the light of their flashlights. A nervous smile was playing around his lips again.
This is it. The cavern. We just need to put the symbol on the wall in blood and...
Blood? It really said blood?
Even as he said it, Christian knew it was true. He'd checked the decoding of the journal himself 6 times. Julian fished out his Swiss Army knife.
I've even got alcohol swabs and a Band-Aid, so I won't get an infection when I cut my thumb.
Instead of responding, Christian's head whipped to the right. He had thought he had heard a sound when Julian talked about cutting himself. There was no one there, as there hadn't been the last 12 times he'd looked. Julian stepped away from the door, though he did not let go of the doorknob, Christian noted, to look down the corridor where Christian was gazing.
Do you see anything?
No, but that doesn't mean there isn't something there.
He added silently.
They could be staying just out of reach of the light.
Christian imagined stalking into the basement without any flashlights, skating along the corridors in pitch blackness and watching people from behind corners. The thought horrified him on some level. It was unnatural to be so calm in this pure darkness. Logic tried to assert itself, to remind him that this was a basement where no monsters dwelled, but his secret was that he had always had a virulent imagination, and he needed to cling to logic to stop his mind from imagining a 20-ring circus. Something about this night was causing him to lose his grip.
Let's go. If there is someone, well, we'll find out soon enough when we discover the city,
Julian said, and Christian heard the click of the doorknob turning and the screech of the aged door opening. The smell of water and stone that rushed out and bathed their faces was 1,000 times stronger than what they had experienced up in the library proper. He and Julian had gone into plenty of caves in their day, but this cavern had the smell of the very deep earth, even though it wasn't all that far underground. The library's pilings had been drilled through parts of the cavern so that the building didn't collapse into it, according to the research they'd done that afternoon. Also, just as the research said, there was a stairwell that had been carved into the raw rock with a now rusted iron railing on their right. Julian cast one last glance at Christian, that nervous smile in full display, and then his best friend was hurrying down the steps.
Julian, be careful. We don't know the condition of the steps.
Christian warned.
They're fine.
Julian called over his shoulder, not slowing down at all. Christian sped up his pace as well, not wanting to lose sight of Julian in this Stygian blackness. The stairs followed the curving outside wall of the cavern. From the description in the journal, the cavern was shaped like a peanut. The stairs opened up into one of the nut chambers, then it narrowed and opened up once more in a second nut chamber. The second nut chamber was where the door to the city of Pale Stone was. They made it down to the cavern's floor after 5 minutes of going down the stairs. Christian played his light over the interior of this nut chamber and let out a low whistle. There were the stone pillars that held up the library proper, but there were also amazing stalactites and stalagmites. The ceiling was 3 stories above their heads. Ahead of them was a winding path between the snow-colored stalagmites leading to the narrowing area. Christian paused to take in the natural beauty of the cavern, but Julian was already moving on. Powdered stone puffed up with every step he took.
Julian, wait!
He called, feeling almost out of breath, catching up with his best friend.
We aren't here to sightsee, Christian.
Julian laughed, though it was a strained laugh.
At least, not until we get to the city of Pale Stone.
Right,
Christian muttered. He reminded himself that there wasn't a city like that, and they would have plenty of time to explore the cavern later.
Just wait a second. I need to get the camera out.
He'd nearly forgotten it, and he never did that. He'd blamed it on the lack of planning for this trip and his unease. He quickly unstrapped it from his body and began to film all around them. As he recorded, he explained where he and Julian were and what they were heading towards. Julian, who usually did this kind of exposition, was far too intent on making it into the far nut chamber to say a word. The narrowing passage was still large enough to hold a bus. Julian ran through it without a glance around him. Christian had enough to do to keep the camera somewhat steady as he jogged behind his best friend. He knew that this footage would cause many of their fans to have motion sickness. Normally, Julian was cognizant of these things, but not this time. Julian only stopped when they were deep into the second chamber, which was double the size of the first. His best friend had gone to a forgettable section of wall that was midway across the curving right wall. The area was not even smooth as some other parts of the cavern's walls appeared to be. It didn't seem a likely place for a magical door. Christian forced himself to keep an open mind, especially as Julian stared at the wall so hard that it appeared like he was trying to see through it. Julian abruptly spun around and looked directly into the camera. Even under the stark light of the flashlights, His best friend's cheeks were a hectic red. His eyes were glittering. He looked like he had a fever, and maybe he did.
"We're here,"
Julian said, and Christian saw him swallow hard. Julian pointed to the nondescript cavern wall.
"It doesn't look like much. It doesn't look like anything, until you get a little closer."
He gestured for Christian to focus in on the wall, about at the height of Christian's head. At first, he saw nothing, and then he saw a faint infinity sign dabbed in blood so old and faded that the blood had turned black and had mostly flaked off. A thrill ran through him.
"My parents were here,"
Julian whispered. Christian's heart broke when Julian said this. The loss of them was something that Julian would never get over. His family had taken Julian in after their deaths. Julian had already been a son to Christian's parents. With the Harrows travelling as much as they did, Julian had often been left behind so that he could attend school, although the Harrows had been talking about schooling him on the road with them before they died. Selfishly, Christian had wanted Julian to stay in town. Julian often lived at his home for weeks on end. They were as much brothers as best friends, and he hadn't wanted to lose that. But he hadn't wanted Julian all to himself either, if that meant the deaths of the Harrows. The snick of the Swiss Army knife being opened drew Christian back to the present. Julian held up the knife and his left thumb so that the camera could see both.
"The way to open the door is to use blood to draw an infinity symbol exactly where my parents did. Sounds easy, I know, but the door was unlocked back then, remember? Hopefully it still is unlocked,"
Julian explained. With no hesitation, Julian cut a long, thin line down his left thumb with the knife, and then squeezed the thumb until bright red blood flowed. Christian did not point out that he hadn't used the alcohol wipes, and he was rather desperate to put a Band-Aid on that cut, but resisted the urge. Julian hadn't even flinched as he'd cut himself. Julian stuffed the knife back into his pocket and turned to the wall. Christian focused the camera in on Julian's hand as his best friend followed the faint outline of his parents' earlier infinity symbol. Julian then stepped back, his hand shaking. At first, nothing happened, and they stared at the unmoving, unchanging wall for long, long moments. It was so long that Christian was about to say something about checking the journal to see if there was anything else they should do, like say some magic words, even though he knew there wasn't anything. But just as he opened his mouth, the wall began to shimmer. And instead of speaking, his mouth simply hung open in speechlessness.
"Please tell me you're filming this,"
Julian whispered as he stepped back to stand beside Christian, as the wall suddenly broke apart into what looked like 1,000,000 blue lightning bugs. These bugs moved, and there was a passage of pale white stone ahead of them.
"I'm filming."
There was a sudden commotion behind them. It was unmistakable. Despite the wonder of the passage ahead of them, Christian whipped around his camera. The teenagers from the reference room were standing there.
"What are you?"
Christian meant to end that question with the words, "doing here?" But instead, he left it at simply, "What are you?" For he noticed something about the couple that he hadn't before. Both the girl and the boy had shining silver eyes.
"You shouldn't be here,"
the girl said, her voice far too adult for her age.
"Celine, we weren't to interfere. Just follow,"
the boy growled.
"We can't let them go to the Everdark.
She said simply, a hint of fangs showing.
Lord Ravenscroft wouldn't like it."
"You're vampires,"
Christian found himself whispering. At the same time, Julian grabbed his arm and yanked him into the passage, shouting one single word at the same time.
"Run!"
Everdark, Episode 3, City of Pale Stone. The moment Julian stepped into the doorway, it felt like someone grabbed the front of his shirt in an iron fist and yanked him forward. His vision blurred, or maybe the world blurred, and he lost sight of the cavern and the passage. He couldn't see Christian either. He couldn't even feel the stone floor beneath his feet. His limbs flailed wildly, as if he were falling from a great height while also being pulled forward. The only stable thing was Christian's arm, that he gripped in a vice-like hold. He would not let go of his best friend. He would not lose him in this in-between place.
Don't let go!
He thought he heard Christian shout.
I won't!
He screamed into the void. Then the world came back, all in a rush. Julian let out an involuntary gasp at the suddenness of it. He stumbled, losing hold of Christian's arm finally, and his own arms pinwheeled wildly. But he did not stop running. Vampires were on their trail. For all he had believed his parents' words, he realized now that he really hadn't believed, or maybe he hadn't understood the enormity of it.
How were the vampires at the library right when we were?
His thoughts tumbled once over the other as rapidly as the beat of his heart.
Were they tracking us? But why? The intro video isn't up. Maybe the vampires have been watching me since my parents died. After all, what is 16 years to them? A blink of an eye? Or maybe they were just watching the library and followed us from the reference room. The library. We're not in the library anymore. Where are we?
The moonlight was so bright that it seemed like day for a moment. The scent of green growing things, sweeter than he had ever smelled them, even out in the middle of nowhere, filled his nostrils as he drew in deep breaths to keep running. He saw pale stone slabs beneath his booted feet. They seemed to glow and gave out sparks with every pound of his feet. Lining the path were trees with trunks as wide as cars, and darkness so velvety black between them that it looked like it had heft.
Trees, white stone path, sky.
Julian looked up at that sky, and he stumbled as he saw twin moons. Twin moons. One blue, one red. 2 moons. They were no longer on Earth.
We're in another world.
Christian crashed into him. They both went down and tumbled onto the stones. Both lay there stunned. Then, panic at the thought of vampires pouncing on them had Julian rolling over onto his back. But that was when he realized that there were no other sounds but his heartbeat and their breathing.
The vampires didn't follow us.
He lifted his head and looked back where they had come. There was no sign of the passage leading back to the cavern beneath the library. There was only a winding stone path through those humongous trees. Christian was suddenly scrambling to his feet and grabbing Julian.
Come on! They're coming! No one is coming. Look.
He pointed back at where they'd come. Christian wheeled around to look where he was indicating. He stopped.
The door's gone. That's good. Maybe? It's just like Mom and Dad wrote. The door disappears once you pass through it. We'll have to go back through the doorway in the city to get home. The city. The city must be nearby.
Christian helped him up to his feet, even as his best friend's eyes were on the empty path, as if not quite believing that it really was free of vampires. Julian looked around them too, breathing in the sweet scent of living things. He couldn't quite believe they were free of the creatures either.
Maybe it's just for a moment, but we're safe. For the moment, anyway.
They were standing on a pale stone path, more like a road in width in what looked to be a massive forest. The stones of the road were smooth and perfectly joined together so that the road was completely flat. None of the roots from the massive trees had caused any of the stones to bulge. That should have indicated habitation, people or vampires replacing the stone slabs that had been pushed up by roots. But Julian just felt that the place was empty.
There is no one here but me and you, and the other that does not matter.
Julian blinked and put a hand to his forehead. Where had that thought come from? It hadn't even sounded like his own voice.
There are 2 moons. 2.
The sheer awe in Christian's voice snapped him out of his thoughts.
It's incredible, isn't it?
Julian looked up at what had stunned him earlier.
One's blue-tinted, and the other is red.
Christian giggled. Christian never giggled.
Red like blood. Red for vampires.
Red for the Everdark. That's what the vampires call this place. This is the Everdark.
Julian rolled that phrase on his tongue. It sounded right somehow.
Fucking vampires.
More giggles burst through Christian's lips.
What gave them away? As not human, I mean. You were pretty convinced that vampires didn't exist before you saw them.
Julian asked.
You mean besides the glowing silver eyes and the fangs? Jesus, fangs! They literally have fangs! Yet they talked around them without any lisps.
And then Christian started laughing so hard that he was doubling over and wrapping his arms around himself. Julian joined him. Both of them were laughing hysterically under an alien night sky. The stars were so thick that there was hardly any blackness. The double moons, one twice the size of the other, hung huge and pregnant in this starry expanse above them. Julian's laughter finally slowed to a few stray chuckles, and he unbent.
There are no other sounds. So silent here, because it's abandoned. But who would abandon such a place? Such a beautiful place.
Why haven't they followed us?
The vampires? I don't know. Maybe they're leery about coming here for some reason.
Julian lifted a hand in uncertainty.
It could be sacred.
Or quarantined?
So positive. Just a bright ray of sunshine. That's my best friend for you.
Julian gave him a lopsided smile.
The vampires didn't seem frightened of much, did they?
Christian asked.
Do you really think some vague stricture against coming into this place is really holding them back? Especially with us in here, undoubtedly polluting it with our mortal bodies?
I admit that it seems strange to think of vampires as religious, but Mom and Dad found this place through using one of their religious texts.
He paused and added,
Mom and Dad never figured out what happened here, but they would have. Thing is that they hardly got to study the place before. Well, they didn't find bodies or anything like that indicating disease or war. They wrote that the city was completely intact, no sign of damage at all.
Yeah, but it feels empty.
Christian slowly turned in a circle, scanning their surroundings.
Weird that the vampires would abandon this place without a good reason to do so.
I am here. Julian jerked his head to the right. The voice seemed to come from there.
But it's inside my head. Christian isn't acting like he heard anything.
Julian pinched the bridge of his nose. His head throbbed, maybe from the fall, maybe from the sheer excitement and terror. In the library, he had felt like a man on fire. He couldn't have stopped it if he had wanted to. Now that he was here, he felt calmer. How that made sense, he didn't know. It was as if he'd reached some checkpoint finally. But what had been the cost of his feverish need to get here, ignoring most of their safety measures and just going in?
We should have prepared better.
Julian turned towards Christian. Christian frowned and his forehead furrowed. It showed how much Christian cared about him that he didn't immediately agree with him.
We didn't know. That vampires were real and that we'd be in an alternate universe tonight? You didn't, but I believed it. Sort of. I just...
He ran a hand through his black hair.
I didn't think...
We were going to the library.
Christian raised an eyebrow.
Nobody's ever afraid of the library.
I pushed us to go here before we checked things out enough.
Julian said, becoming serious.
Maybe we would have seen the vampires.
They looked like normal teenagers.
We should have come during the day.
We don't know if vampires can't come out during the day.
True.
We know nothing about them. Well, except for the fangs and silver eyes thing.
Christian's forehead was bunched.
But we don't know if they're immortal, or drink blood, or can't walk in sunlight, or are allergic to garlic. Does holy water work on them? Or what about crosses? Or...
I'm thinking that we should assume all the bad stuff about them is true. You know, the blood drinking and the super strength. Hell, maybe they can turn into smoke, or bats.
Julian said.
We assume the worst, and hopefully that'll keep us safe until we can figure out the truth about them.
Christian nodded, but suddenly a rather bright smile and a hysterical chuckle.
Vampires are real.
Julian grinned back, even as his heart clenched a little at the thought that vampires likely really had killed his parents.
It's crazy.
It's more than that.
Christian ruffled his own hair, pacing for a moment.
There's so much to know. It changes everything. This place, them.
He stopped and grasped Julian's shoulders.
Do you realize how knowledge about this place and vampires is completely going to rewrite history and medicine and religion? You know that, right?
Yeah, and the vampires are ready to kill to stop that from happening.
Julian said, swallowing sudden bile.
You can almost understand it.
The moment that Christian said it, he clearly regretted it. He put a hand on Julian's shoulder.
I didn't mean it like that. Your parents...
And us, Christian. My parents knew and wanted to tell the world. We now know and want to tell the world.
Julian reminded him. Christian went still. He didn't even blink.
So we're their enemy number one now.
I'd say that's about right.
Julian's eyes went to the road. No teenage vampires. But he was less easy than before that they would stay away forever. Whatever was holding the vampires back wouldn't last forever.
We're too important to let go. We need to get out of here. What does the journal say about the door back?
Christian asked. Julian pulled out the journal and opened to that first well-worn page of when his parents had come here and seen Everdark.
Everdark. Mom would have loved that name.
He knew that they didn't have time for this, but he found himself reading a few passages that were written by his mother about finding this place.
We found ourselves in what I would almost call a primordial forest. Trees that had stood for thousands of years. Not just decades or even centuries. Millennia. Jack and I joked that perhaps the vampires could teach humans a thing or two about living with nature instead of against it. The smooth stone of the road was perfect. You couldn't have slid a thin dime between the slabs, yet there was this sense of great age about it. And then we saw the city, almost floating above the treetops. And everything that Jack and I thought we knew, well, we realized we didn't know a thing.
Julian looked up, but he could only see the trees. He took a few steps back away from the edge of the path, and he saw what his parents had seen. Like them, he suddenly felt he knew nothing at all either. The city of pale stone flew graceful towers, delicate minarets, sweeping domes, and soaring bridges, so huge and intricate that Julian could not take it all in with a single look, above the sea of trees. The architecture was elegant and brilliant. Julian could tell from just looking at it that the city was built with a singular vision.
Do you like my city?
Julian took a step back. The voice had been so loud and clear and definite, and it was coming from the city.
Am I imagining this? Mom and Dad never mentioned a voice, but they did feel pulled sometimes. They would find themselves searching the city for something, but they could never find it. Was it you?
He directed that last thought at the voice, but heard nothing in reply.
What is it?
Christian joined him and drew in a sharp breath. But it wasn't because of the voice. It was just seeing the city.
It's beautiful.
The city of Palestone was beautiful. So beautiful that Julian's heart ached.
I should hate it. I should only think of it as a pale stone grave marker for my parents. This caused their deaths. This beautiful, treacherous place. The architecture.
Christian began and stopped. Julian looked over at him. His best friend was reaching towards the city, as if he could physically grasp it, following the lines of it with his fingers. Though he had the mind of a scientist, Julian thought that his best friend had the hands of an artist.
There are elements here from multiple Earth cultures. Minarets are typically associated with mosques. Domes are thought to have originated from early Mesopotamia. Those bridges.
You're thinking that the vampires got their ideas about architecture from us?
Julian lifted an eyebrow.
Or we got them from the vampires. If they've been visiting our world for centuries, millennia, or however long, then...
Christian shook his head again as if he couldn't quite contemplate it all.
Julian, they could have been influencing human culture all along. For all we know, they could have been influencing more than that.
Such as?
We genetically modify crops to give greater yield, be healthier.
Genetically modified humans?
Julian's eyebrows rose.
Why not? If we're their food source, they'd be very careful with us. Animal husbandry.
Christian said quietly.
Oh, God, let's not talk about that.
Just think. They probably made some of us to have tastier blood, or more blood maybe. Others they breed to make into themselves. Perhaps the uber-talented, or beautiful, or...
Julian held up a hand to stop him.
I know you want to think all this through right now, but those teenage vampires could get here any moment.
Quite.
Christian looked almost crestfallen, and Julian would have felt bad if he didn't actually believe what he said. Julian quickly flipped through the journal to the section where his parents described how they got back to Earth. It was in a building that his parents had termed the Octagon because of its shape. There was one doorway into the Everdark, but there were many doorways out. Putting the infinity symbol on the octagon would get them back to Earth. He memorized the route from the central plaza, then slipped the journal back into his pants pocket.
Got it?
Christian asked.
2 rights and a left.
When Christian gave him a raised eyebrow, he said,
I have it, don't worry. But we have to get to the city first, and we should be prepared this time. I didn't completely forget about security.
He took off his backpack and unzipped the front pocket. He drew out his Glock 19.
Do bullets work on vampires?
Christian's eyebrows were raised.
No idea, but maybe I could wing one, slow them down. You've never shot anything but cans all your life. Are you really ready to shoot at people?
Christian didn't hide the disbelief in his voice.
And don't tell me vampires aren't people. Those teenagers? I had no idea what they were until they showed up with glowing eyes and fangs. They looked normal. Yeah, they did.
Julian, though, tucked the gun in the back of his pants. He lightly hit his best friend's shoulder.
Are you capturing this? Parallel universe? Vampires? On video? Evidence ringing a bell?
Christian had slid his camera back into its holster at some point. His best friend let out a curse and brought the camera up.
God damn it. Second time I've forgotten I should be filming.
Christian grumbled.
Shows this place has knocked you off your game.
Julian slipped the backpack back on, casting one last glance up the road. Still, no vampires, thankfully. But how long could that really last? He gestured for them to go down the road.
Let's go. I think we've stayed here way too long.
Christian nodded, but he was panning the camera right, then left, trying to capture the enormity of the city of pale stone.
Aren't you going to say anything? Later. I think the images speak for themselves.
I don't only write about vampires and dragons. I tend to mix my genres and creatures, but they all have gay romance, action, and adventure, happily ever afters, and something magical or wondrous about the world. On wraithrain.com, you can find gay romance stories about elves, futuristic cities, demons and angels, crime lords, and more. I'll post a link to the library in the notes below.
They both started jogging down the white stone road in the direction of the city. The road took several graceful turns, but then it straightened out. The trees thinned, and the city was before them. It was surrounded by a high wall. Julian had to crane his neck back to see the top of it. Though it should have been impossible, the wall seemed to be carved out of a single block of stone. It looked to stretch over a mile in either direction. Directly ahead of them was an arched gate that stood over 30 feet high. There were doors made of a silvery metal that were cracked open just enough for a single person to slide through.
Anybody home?
Julian asked with a nervous laugh attached to the end of it.
The way those teenage vampires moved, so silent. Would we know if anyone was here?
Christian asked.
They talk though, right? Vampires talk. A whole city of them wouldn't be quiet as the grave. Besides, Mom and Dad said that it was just like this. Empty.
Julian gestured towards the space.
Beyond those doors will be the Half Moon Plaza. Remember from the journal? Those huge, almost Beaux-Arts structures lining it and stretching up to the sky? With the big balcony.
Christian nodded, but his gaze was intent on the screen.
Let's go in and see how it compares in real life. I'll film you. You just want me to go first.
A half smile curled Christian's lips.
Damn straight. Now go on, Kirk. I've got your back. You know, it never made sense that they would have all the officers, especially the captain, risk his life on missions in that way. True, but neither you nor Kirk would have it any other way. Now look pretty. We should only film a little before we head to the door. Right.
A trickle of excitement and unease skated down Julian's spine. He was going to enter the city of pale stone.
Finally.
Julian could just squeeze through the gap. His shoulders touched the cold metal of the doors. As they did, an electric zing went through them and he stumbled forwards. He brought his hands up to his shoulders, drawing down the collar of his shirt to see if he was burned or marked or something.
Nothing. I'm fine.
He called over to Christian.
Be careful of touching the metal. It's electrified or something. It feels like magic.
Julian shook himself. He didn't know what magic felt like. He didn't know that magic was real. It was science, just science they didn't understand yet.
No wonder Mom and Dad love this place. For every answer, there's a million questions. Will do,
Christian called back. Then Julian was struck dumb again. His parents had described this opening as a meeting area. It was empty now, but he could imagine it filled with a roaring crowd. There was a stunning mosaic of the rising moons on the horizon inlaid on the floor. The buildings ahead of him followed that curve and soared so high that it looked like they might touch the real moons above. There was a balcony that ran the length of the buildings. It was on the 3rd floor. He could imagine some vampire politician, or maybe a king or queen, speaking to a roaring crowd of vampires.
What would they be promising their people? A human in every pot? Blood for everyone?
My blessing, the voice said.
What?
Julian's head jerked towards a curving road to his left. The voice was back and coming from there.
What's your blessing?
Julian asked. Silence.
Am I losing my mind?
He saw Christian enter the city, filming all the while, panning over the mosaic and the balcony.
And if I really think I'm hearing voices from here, I should tell Christian.
But he found himself turning away from his best friend. He drifted over to one of the buildings, the one nearest the road to the left. He told himself that he wasn't trying to hear the voice again. There were engravings on the pale stone to look at. There were infinite symbols with what looked like writing in the center. Julian ran his hands over the word, and he thought he saw sparks again. First among equals, the voice said. Julian jumped again, but quickly asked,
Is that what this word or phrase means?
He expected silence, but instead he was answered. That is who I am.
Where are you? Are you in the city?
Now there was silence. He touched the writing again, but nothing.
Being shy again?
Julian asked.
Or am I just crazy?
Absolutely nothing now. Julian sighed, noticed that there were also engravings of flowers, vines and trees done with exquisite detail. These vampires were more than just predators. They had art and culture. This reminded him of the ancient Greeks at the height of their civilization. He'd read about this in his parents' journals, but it hadn't stuck with him somehow.
Why does it have to be so beautiful?
Julian looked at the doors that led into the buildings and wondered what was inside. His parents had said that the doors had remained shut and locked no matter what they did. Windows were shuttered too. His parents had consoled themselves with the fact that any furniture, linens or books would likely be dust and ashes. But Julian didn't believe that. He felt that inside the silks would be as fresh as the day the doors were closed. There would be books full of secrets, myths, and salacious gossip.
So much to learn, and we really can't stay. Not this time anyway. Not until we bring news crews in, and lights so bright that no vampire will dare to come near. Julian?
Christian's tone had him jerking his head towards his best friend.
What is it?
Julian turned. Christian was pointing the camera not inside at the magnificent square, but outside at the woods. Christian slammed the camera back into his holster, and he was putting his shoulder against the one door and started pushing on it.
Help me! Help me! They're coming!
Christian cried out. Julian raced over to the other door and with a moment's hesitation put his shoulder against it. That cold electric zap went through him, but he didn't jerk away this time. The doors groaned, but began to shut an inch at a time. Julian happened to glance between the ever-shortening gap and saw the two teenage vampires coming with astounding speed towards them. The girl was ahead of the boy by a few paces. Her silver eyes flashed. The doors shut, and a moment later he heard her hit them like a bullet. They shuddered, but remained closed.
Come on, let's go! This isn't going to hold them!
Julian shouted. Already the doors were starting to groan as the attack on them continued. He and Christian raced across the square towards one of the main thoroughfares that extended out from it, like the rays of the sun. It was the one to the left, the one he'd heard the voice from, and somehow he felt that this was right. He should go this way.
Yes, come to me,
the voice said.
Where you will be safe. Safe with me.
Who are you?
Julian demanded, even as he put a burst of new speed into his pace.
The only one who can save you,
the voice answered.
Where's the Octagon building?
Christian gasped out. Julian opened his mouth to tell him that they'd missed the passage, that they needed to double back, but he just said,
This way. Are you controlling me?
Julian asked the voice.
I didn't tell Christian about you. and I didn't mean to say what I just did to him. So what the fuck are you doing?
Of course, there were no words in response. Julian was getting used to that. But he felt a tug this way or that as they reached intersections. He followed those tugs. Each time it was the right thing to do. They avoided ambushes by the teenage vampires who had decided that running along rooftops and balconies was better than on the ground. One time when he almost went the opposite way of one of the tugs, the female vampire, Celine, he thought her name was, jumped down right where he would have been if he hadn't quickly backed out.
Why are you helping us?
Julian asked the voice as they ducked through an alleyway.
To see.
To see what?
If you are strong enough,
the voice answered with a chuckle.
Strong enough for what?
To save yourself. Now run.
Run! Run! They ran deeper and deeper into the city, well past where his parents had ever travelled. The Harrows had acted like real archaeologists, while he and Christian had just come with a camera and their wits. He couldn't wait to get the proof he needed for things like a plan or permits. He did feel the weight of the gun. Would he have to use it? Would it even work?
Just keep running. We'll lose them, somehow,
he told himself. Julian chanced a glance over at Christian. His best friend's cheeks were flushed. His lips were parted. His eyes were wild. His own lungs were burning. The muscles in his legs felt like they were going to give out, but both of them kept going. The tugging sensation was much stronger directly ahead of them, and then he saw the building that the voice was leading them to.
Yes,
the voice murmured.
You are almost there.
There was a staircase ahead of them, wide and low steps that led to a graceful gold-domed building. While everything else had just been the plain but beautiful white stone, this gold dome made the building stand out. It glittered like the pulsing heart of the city.
There they are.
A female voice rang with predatory glee. The male vampire cried,
Celine, we're not to harm them. Lord Balthazar...
Get there before they get away.
She ignored the other vampire's words. They had reached the top of the stairs and through a colonnade of columns to a set of golden doors. The teenage vampires were at the bottom of the stairs, their starry night eyes fixed upon him and Christian. The male vampire leaped, and he was halfway up the flight.
Impossible,
Julian thought.
Through there,
Julian cried, and pointed to a set of crystalline doors ahead of them. Maybe they could get inside and brace them. Then they could go out the back.
If there's a back door,
he realized with despair. But there was no time for second-guessing. He threw himself at one of the crystalline doors. It opened effortlessly under his hands. He saw inside what looked like a white sarcophagus in the center of a circular room. But more importantly, he saw another set of doors on the opposite side.
You're here,
the voice said, full of dark satisfaction.
What? Where?
Julian cried. He cast around everywhere.
With me.
The voice deepened, darkened. The doors slammed shut behind him, before Christian could follow him inside. Julian heard Christian bash into the doors. Julian spun around and saw his best friend tugging at them.
No! Christian!
He screamed. There were no door handles and no locks on his side. It was just smooth glass. The male teenage vampire was suddenly there. He wound an arm around Christian's throat. His best friend's nostrils were flared like a frightened colt's. The male teenage vampire's silver eyes were on him.
Open the door.
His voice was muffled through the crystalline door.
Don't do it, Julian!
Christian warned.
Silence, or I will silence you forever.
The teenage male vampire threatened and increased his hold on Christian's throat until his friend let out a choked cry.
I can't!
Julian cried.
The doors are locked.
They will kill him and you if I open the doors, the voice said. A masculine voice, commanding.
They're definitely going to kill Christian if you don't,
Julian asked, feeling betrayed by that voice.
Where are you? Where?
Right here, behind you. Julian spun around in the room, looking for the owner of the voice, but there was no one there.
Open them, or your friend will pay,
the male teenage vampire threatened. His hands tightened on Christian's throat, and his best friend let out a hiss, but said nothing.
They're locked or something. Let me try the other doors, please. I'm not running. Don't hurt Christian.
Julian begged. There is only one way to save him and yourself. The voice was patient, almost amused, as if Julian's little plans were nothing. Julian held up his hands as if to show the teenage male vampire that his intentions were good. Julian backed away, feeling the press of the gun against his spine. He had to get to it, but not while the door separated him and Christian. Once he was out there again, the weapon would be more useful. Your weapon will do nothing, the voice mocked. Just annoy them, and Christian's neck will be broken in an instant. There is only one way to save him and yourself.
What way would that be?
Julian demanded to know. Julian's left hip brushed against the sarcophagus at that moment. He glanced down at it. A statue lay upon it. The stone was shaped into a man's hooded and cloaked form. The folds of the material were incredibly realistic. The man's arms were crossed over his chest. He was holding a flower, a rose. The petals were dipped in that strange silvery metal and looked incredibly sharp. The hood was pulled down so that all he could see was the chin, lips, a bit of a nose, and a powerful jaw. The lips were plush and sensual, drawn in an almost pout. For a moment, Julian desperately wanted to know what the man's face looked like.
He must be beautiful,
Julian mused, forgetting everything else. You will judge for yourself. The voice rolled out with sensual laughter. Julian jerked back from the sarcophagus.
That's you? That's where you are? In a coffin?
A sleeping chamber for the ages.
Are you going to get up?
Julian asked. Julian reached the opposite set of doors. They, too, did not have any handles or locks. Celine was suddenly before him on the other side of the door. She drew back her right hand and smashed it against the glass. If it had been truly glass, it would have shattered. But instead she let out a howl of agony and pulled her hand back. He saw that the bones in it were all broken. Bits of bone stuck through her flesh. Blood dripped rich and lovely on the white floor.
Fuck,
Julian breathed. Do not worry, she will heal. See, she is already, the voice said. Julian watched as the bones and flesh knit themselves together again. She hissed at him, banging against the glass, but lighter this time.
Come out here! Come out, or I will drain every last drop of blood from Christian!
She snapped, her fangs flashing in the moonlight. She will do that in any event. She was sent here to kill you, the voice said.
Why? Because we found out vampires exist?
Julian gasped. No, because you found this place. You found me. The voice, no, he answered. Now, do you wish to survive?
Of course I do.
Julian let out a hysterical laugh.
You know I do.
Life runs strongly in you, so different from those before that fell into darkness, he answered. And there was such a bleakness in his tone that Julian hurt hearing it. It has been long years since I was brought an offering. Your blood, though, may be enough.
My blood? You're a vampire too, aren't you?
Julian was looking at the sarcophagus, at the beautiful man who lay upon it, a reflection of the beautiful man who was inside it.
Of course you're a vampire.
I am an immortal, he corrected, as though there was a difference. Do you see the flower upon the sculpture's chest?
Yeah, hard to miss. Looks sharp,
Julian remarked. That is the point of it. Lay your hand upon it, he instructed. The flower was so delicate to look upon, and yet it seemed far from an innocent flower, but a weapon.
What'll happen when I touch it?
Julian asked. What do you think? Amused again. Laughter, rich and rolling, filled Julian's mind.
Spell it out for me,
Julian replied, gritting his teeth. Besides the voice, he could only seem to hear his own heartbeat in his ears. His eyes flickered to where Christian and the teenage male vampire still stood. Celine and the teenage male vampire were arguing fiercely. She was snapping the air with her teeth when he kept shaking his head. Christian's gaze caught Julian's, and Julian's heart rate sped up to twice the rate as before. They cannot get inside. Not until I will it, the immortal answered.
I've got to get out to Christian. I have a weapon.
Julian snarled, which is useless. The immortal was patient again. You saw Celine's hand. Your bullets will do even less damage.
You know what bullets are?
Julian laughed. Because you do. Now, I will make you a deal. Use your blood to wake me, and I will protect you, the immortal offered. I give you my word. The face of his parents flashed before his mind.
What is a vampire's word worth?
I did not harm them. They felt my voice, but could not truly hear it. I thought they might, in time, the immortal answered. But you can trust me, because I want your blood. Celine had suddenly grabbed Christian from the teenage male vampire. Her fangs extended farther than before, and she poised them above Christian's throat. His best friend let out a cry of pain and thrashed in her arms, but she held him tighter, and he stilled.
Find a way out now, or he will bleed.
Don't hurt him! Don't you dare hurt him!
Do we have a deal? The immortal asked.
You'll save us? You promise?
Julian demanded, his right hand moving over towards the flower while his eyes stayed fixed on Christian's face. He swore he could hear the immortal smile as he said, I promise. Julian closed his eyes just as he slammed his hand down onto the flower of knives. Everdark, Episode 4, Blessing and a Curse. There should have been pain, endless amounts of it. Agony, really. Julian had crazily slammed his hand into a flower made up of knives. But there wasn't. There was no pain at all, but a sort of slithering pleasure that corkscrewed from his hand up into his body. It flowed down his spine and bloomed in his belly. And then there was the presence. The voice that had been in his mind before was suddenly reaching into the very core of him. Almost like a caress, the immortal brushed his mind against Julian's. The thought that he should protect himself somehow from this floated through Julian's brain, but it was too late. The immortal was already there, already seeing, already knowing. In those few fractions of a moment, Julian was laid bare. Julian had the impression of the immortal, looking just like the statue swathed in a cloak, standing atop a cliff and staring down at a sea of trees, and that sea of trees was Julian. More than his mind, but his soul. All of him was spread out for the immortal to sift through. The immortal could pluck at any memory, any feeling, any desire, and Julian would be unable to stop him.
What are you doing?
Julian finally managed to cry out. Knowing you was the answer. Betrayal swam through Julian. He'd thought to just give his blood, not his mind, not his soul.
You didn't tell me that it would be like this.
Julian shouted.
You're just supposed to take my blood and save my friend.
In his mind, the immortal's lips quirked into a smile. Those plush lips that Julian could imagine, perhaps had imagined, at his throat were pulled back to reveal white, sharp teeth that glinted in the moonlight. You did not ask, and you would not have cared. The immortal answered, You want to save your friend, and this is the only way. That was true. He would have agreed to do this. He would have agreed to much more to save Christian. The other young man was his best friend, and he had dragged him into this mess.
But you don't have to do this.
Julian realized as the knowing continued.
You don't have to know me to drink my blood.
You are becoming a part of me, the immortal explained. I would know who it is that has woken me.
After you save us from these crazy vampires, we can have a drink. Shoot the shit. You can ask me about myself, but you have no right to this.
There was a pause before the immortal responded to him. A sense that perhaps he had gone too far, that perhaps Julian had a point. But then the immortal said, That would only reveal your surface. I would know more.
You have no right to more.
I am king, I have the right to all I conquer, the immortal responded. Julian felt prickles of heated pleasure start to bloom in his hand. He looked down at where it was attached to the flower. That was when the flower started to move. It started to grow. The leaves twisted up into Julian's palm. Thin tendrils slipped into his veins and arteries. He could feel them moving up inside of his arm. Then he could see them gliding underneath his skin, following the hidden pathways of his body. He let out a startled cry and tried to pull back, but more tendrils, clear like flexible tubing tipped with silver, wrapped around his fingers, and then around his wrist, and then up and around his forearm. The barbed ends sliced into his skin. Again there was no pain, but more pleasure. Sweat broke out across his upper lip and forehead. The clear tendrils turned red and began to pulse as they drew out more of his blood. They pulsed like a heart would beat.
What is this?
Julian gasped.
What?
My mouth cannot be at your throat, beautiful boy. I am not yet free, but when I am,
The immortal murmured.
I will fulfill your wish and kiss you. I slide my fangs into the soft flesh of your throat. Let my tongue linger on your pulse point.
I don't want that.
Liar, came the haunting voice that echoed through his mind. Julian felt his blood being drawn through the tendrils into the statue. He could almost feel that blood igniting the long-dead flesh of the immortal. It was causing the immortal to come alive again. But how much blood would it take to accomplish this? All of him? Every last drop?
I am not going to kill you,
The immortal assured him, the voice gauzy with desire now as the blood warmed the long, cold flesh. The tone reminded Julian of a lover who was drunk on wine and passion, but it was his blood that was entrancing this creature. Terror flooded Julian. Would the immortal let him go before all of his blood was gone?
I did promise.
The immortal whispered.
How much do you have to take?
Julian gripped the wrist of his bound hand with his free one. He tried to pull himself off the flower, but it did not even budge. He would not be able to break the connection.
Enough, but not enough. Never enough. So hungry, starving. Too long have I been without. Too long, too long, too long.
The voice whispered, and he heard the hunger in it.
You need too much. I can feel it.
The pleasure was nearly sickening now, as Julian could feel the being he was connected to. He could feel the immortal's hunger. He had not been fed in too long, and the need to drink was so strong that it felt like a tidal wave was bearing down upon Julian. He tugged at his hand again.
You have to stop.
Not enough. Not enough. I need more of you. I will not let you go until I have more of you.
The immortal's voice coiled in his mind like a serpent.
How much more?
Julian demanded.
Comfort yourself with the knowledge that even if I betray you, you would have made no other choice.
The immortal told him.
That's not comforting.
Julian was starting to feel lightheaded. His legs seemed to ooze out from underneath him, and he found himself half lying on the figure.
Fate never is to a fighter, and you are a fighter. I admire that.
I don't care what you admire.
He was getting tired, so tired. He wanted to close his eyes and abandon himself to the sliding, warm pleasure that weighed down his limbs, but he forced them to stay open. He was a fighter, just as the immortal had said. He would not die, not without a fight anyways.
You are fierce, too.
That seemed to delight the immortal.
I see you want me to earn your respect. I wonder if I will have the time to do so.
What do you mean? You're eternal. Unless you mean I won't be around. You must let me go.
I need you, Julian.
It was the first time the immortal had said his name. It sank into Julian's bones. He stilled and closed his eyes. Julian. Had his parents heard another vampire whisper their names before killing them?
I did not kill your kin. You should hope their deaths were like this, and not in confusion and fear, the immortal pointed out.
Who are you?
Julian found himself asking back.
Tell me the name of the being I'm bringing back to life.
There was a pause, a long pause, as if imparting a name was incredibly fraught. But finally, the immortal answered. Damon. That is what your people called me. That is the name I give to you. The immortal pronounced it Damon, but Julian knew it was spelled daemon and meant demon.
You're gonna kill me if you keep going.
Julian found himself saying almost softly, No, 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 my fierce warrior. Damon's voice, though, was slurred, almost like a man drunk. Halfway back will not do you or Christian any good. I still need more.
You're too far gone to stop.
Julian feared.
You won't stop in time. I'm gonna die. Promise me you'll save Christian.
Just a little more, Julian. The lack of a promise had strength flooding Julian's limbs, and he scrambled to his feet again, though he was still leaning heavily on the statue. He yanked again and again and again on his bound hand. No movement. Panic had his heart hammering in his chest. That was the only thing he could hear. He let out a scream of frustration, and that caused the gun to shift against his back. He stilled.
Maybe I could shoot the statue. Break the connection between me and Damon.
He reached around and grabbed the gun. He brought it around. The matte finish and the weight of it in his hand was somehow comforting. He could smell the hint of gun oil. He slid off the safety and tried slipping it beneath the hand that was attached to the statue. He knew he might blow his own hand off when he pulled the trigger, but it was that, or death. Damon was lost to the need to feed. Already Julian's burst of strength had waned to almost nothing. Damon wanted to drag him into darkness. It was taking all of his willpower to keep going.
I just have to pull the trigger. Easy, right? Easy.
Julian looked at the statue's hooded face as he took in a deep breath. A spray of his blood from the initial placement of his hand on the flower dotted the chest of the stone figure. One drop had caught on the statue's chin. It lay there, glittering like a ruby. That chin and those lips were gorgeous, inviting to be kissed, hiding fangs, he imagined. Suddenly the single ruby-red drop of blood moved of its own accord. It travelled up to the lips and sank between them like it had been sipped up.
What the?
Julian stared at where it had disappeared dumbly. And then something else impossible happened. Flakes of stone began to rise up in the air as if the top layer of the statue was peeling away. This material was as thin as a single piece of paper. The flakes rose up to the top of the golden dome before they shimmered out of existence.
It's beautiful. Why does it have to be beautiful?
Julian's now near-constant refrain about vampires went through his mind, even as wonder blocked out the fact that he was being drained dry. Beneath the layer of stone that was rising up and disappearing was not more stone, but flesh. Julian watched as the statue's plush lips that had been still and incapable of movement suddenly parted, and the statue took his first breath in who knew how long. The cloak that had looked so real, captured in marble, suddenly shifted against his skin as it became cloth. Julian could feel stone limbs suddenly become soft and supple beneath him.
Damon? Damon, can you hear me?
Julian's gaze went to Christian and Celine to see if they were seeing this too, as if to confirm his own senses. His eyes met his best friend's. There was no fear in his best friend's gaze. Instead, there was only wonder. Celine, however, was looking on with horrified fascination, as if she just couldn't believe her eyes. Julian was reminded of a child looking under the bed for a monster, not really thinking it was going to be there, because one never had been, and monsters weren't real, right? But finding herself face to face with a particularly nasty specimen.
Who are you, Damon, that your own kind doesn't know you?
Then black spots suddenly started appearing before his vision, and Julian knew he had to pull the trigger or he was going to die. Yet he wasn't shooting a statue now, but a person. Sickness rose up in the back of his throat as he saw those plush lips go from pale to pink as colour flooded them. The skin, too, took on a warmer glow, the glow of life.
Damon, you have to let me go. I'm gonna shoot you if you don't, and that'll be bad,
Julian cried. His legs completely slipped out from underneath him now. His head was so light that he felt it might float away. A grey haze was settling over his vision as well as the black spots now. He wasn't sure if he could aim the gun properly.
Damon, please, stop. I'm dying.
Never, Damon whispered. And suddenly, he was sitting up and holding Julian up as well. The statue was a man, a vampire, an immortal. Damon took the gun from him as if he were a child and threw it somewhere with a flicker of disgust on those plush lips. Julian's head was bobbing like a heavy flower, and he couldn't focus on where it had gone. The tendrils that had sunk deep into his body were withdrawing, though, and he could feel that intensely. He felt their loss with the keenness of a blade against his throat. He saw the flower was no longer metal and stone, but a living bloom with petals as red as blood. His blood. "Thank you, Julian," Damon murmured. The immortal's hooded head leaned closer to Julian. With a shaking hand, the one that had connected them, but showing no damage now, Julian found himself reaching for that hood. He had to see Damon's face. He had to. He needed to know. But Damon was suddenly whipping his head to the side to where Celine still held Christian, except she wasn't just holding him. She'd sunk her fangs into his throat.
I write what I like to read and what I want to see in the world. This is why a lot of my stories have strong threads, not only of true love, but also strong friendships, justice, loyalty, and good versus evil. No matter what setting I write in, whether it's fantasy, aliens, vampires, or shifters, you'll find this stuff in most of my stories, including this one. They all have gay romance, action, and adventure, happily ever afters, and something magical or wondrous about the world. On wraithrain.com, you can find gay romance stories about elves, futuristic cities, demons and angels, crime lords, and more. I'll post a link to the library in the notes below.
No!
Julian wailed. Too weak, too slow. These thoughts from Damon slipped over to Julian, and he wondered if the immortal had meant them to. There was disgust in the immortal's voice towards himself.
Celine! What are you doing?
The teenage male vampire shouted, clearly shocked at her behavior. Christian's eyes went unfocused, and then started to darken with death. Julian screamed his best friend's name, but his voice was hollow.
You promised! You have to save him!
Julian yelled, even as his body slumped. And then Damon was gently but swiftly lowering him to the floor of the tomb. Julian lay there like a dead thing, unable to even speak now. He could only watch. And he watched as Celine dropped his friend to the floor like he was a juice drink package that had been finished. Christian looked grey, and his eyes were closed. She then dropped into a fighting stance, bobbing and weaving on her feet, fingers outstretched at her sides like claws and fangs barred. She hissed at Damon. The teenage male vampire, whatever objections he'd had to her draining Christian, was at her side. Clearly he valued whatever connection was between them over her hurting Christian. Damon didn't open the doors and step out to face her. No. He burst through the glass and stone that had broken Celine's hands with a simple punch, except there were no marks on the cloaked and hooded figure at all. Julian saw a spark of fear enter Celine's eyes as she realized this too. But it was too late. Damon grabbed her by the shoulders and brought his mouth to her throat. She struggled, but it was like a kitten in the hands of a giant. She could do nothing. He crushed her resistance, and he tore the front of her neck open and began to drink. The spray of blood soaked his chin and lips, but it just as quickly was absorbed into Damon's body like the single drop of blood had been. Nothing wasted and no mess. The teenage male vampire, stunned into immobility for a moment, finally gathered himself together again and launched himself at Damon. The immortal's left hand shot out and grasped him around the neck, and held him a foot above the ground while he continued to feast on Celine. The teenage male vampire thrashed and raked his fingers over the hand that held him, but it was no good. He might as well have been petting Damon for all the harm it did. Celine's eyes were fixed on Julian as she died for the second time. He watched as her skin went pale and then started to crack. It was as if she was turning to stone. Damon removed his fangs from her and tossed her body aside. When it struck the ground, it shattered, turning to dust, and immediately was caught by an invisible wind that dispersed it. Damon, though, was evidently still hungry. He brought the teenage male vampire's throat to his mouth and began to drain him. Julian watched as the teenager's eyes fluttered shut for the last time. He watched as he turned to stone. He watched as he drifted away in the breeze. Damon stood there, unmoving for long moments, still cloaked and hooded, still hidden. But then he swung around and crouched by Christian's side. Julian let out a croaked
No.
fearing that Damon intended to finish what Celine had started.
If Christian isn't already dead.
That thought could not stand. That thought could not exist. Tears slid down Julian's face even as he raged inside. He wanted to be the one that touched Christian's throat and checked for a pulse. He willed his body to move, but it would not. His fingers flexed slightly against the stone floor. That was all that moved. Damon tenderly lifted Christian and brought him to Julian's side. He laid Julian's best friend down beside him and put Christian's hand in his. Christian's eyes were closed. He was still breathing, but barely. Julian squeezed that hand with as much strength that he had left.
Christian.
Julian breathed.
I'm so sorry.
Julian, I have hard things to tell you. Damon's voice was almost kind, but also very definite. Christian is going to die. Julian's eyes widened and a thin wail came out of his mouth that sounded more like a whisper.
No, that can't be.
There is nothing to stop it. He will die. Celine not only took too much blood, but infected him with a disease that will end his life. Damon's tone brooked no argument, but more than that, his thoughts showed no lies. The only way he can be saved is for him to be turned.
Turned? Into a vampire? That's what you mean, isn't it?
Julian realized even as his insides felt coated with ice. He and Christian had come here to prove vampires existed, to out them to the world, not to become one of them. Yes, definite, fact, unchangeable. Julian's heart fluttered.
By you?
No, that was just as definite as the fact that Christian would die.
I don't understand.
Julian confessed. There was one of those pregnant pauses that boded some important information was going to be imparted which Damon didn't wish to tell him. I have no fledglings, Damon said with bitterness laced through every word. Every person I tried to turn has died. My blood is too potent and is toxic to your kind. It is one of the reasons It does not matter. What does is that I am unable to help your friend.
But then why didn't you leave one of the others alive?
Julian cried.
Didn't you realize what had happened to Christian? If you left the boy alive instead of drinking him dry.
Damon held up a long-fingered, elegant hand. They were too young to turn others.
Are there other vampires in this city?
Night Valen, Damon murmured. The name was beautiful. Again, beauty in the horror. But anger lit inside of Julian and he shot back.
I don't care what your goddamn city is called. Are there any vampires here that can save Christian?
No.
No.
Julian felt the world open up beneath him and his body to start to slip into the abyss. But where you come from, there are, Damon added quickly. One's there that could help him.
Can you contact them? Can you bring Christian to them?
No.
Why not? You failed in your promise. I heard you curse yourself. Too weak, too slow. I heard you.
Julian raged, even as only his fingers could twitch.
You failed. You have to make this right.
There was another of those pregnant pauses that made Julian want to rip his hair out. But then, an answer. I cannot contact them. Their minds are closed to me until I come to your world.
Then come to my world, the Octagon building.
I cannot leave Nightvallen yet. I am too weak. I cannot pass. The city will not let me. Damon interrupted smoothly. But you can. Julian felt a choking sob rising up within him. He could only twitch his fingers, nothing more. He couldn't even sit up. Damon knew this.
You took too much.
Julian's voice held the accusation. I took what I needed and what you offered. Damon's voice was not censorious, but it held truth.
I can't get him back. I'd have to carry him, and I can't even stand.
Julian said.
You know that.
Damon carefully responded. There is a way to give you the strength you need for a time.
Great.
But there is a price. Julian saw Damon's lips pressed together as if holding back a tsunami of emotions. He realized that they were still speaking mind to mind, though Damon was alive again, and that damned hood still obscured most of his face. The need to see that face was almost overwhelming, even with the horror of Christian's death looming ahead of him.
What price? I'll pay it.
Julian recklessly promised.
You were right before. It doesn't matter what happens to me. I have to save Christian. I'll do it no matter what it is. He's only here because of me.
Julian swallowed, but guilty bile still rose up in his stomach. Christian had wanted to wait and investigate cautiously. Christian had urged Julian to bring more people, more protection, more everything. But he'd been determined to go then and there. What a fool he had been, and Christian was now paying the price for it. Damon did not move nor speak. He seemed like a statue again, but finally he nodded. I am glad I know you. I am glad I looked, that I violated your privacy while I could.
Why? I can't see.
Because I know that you mean what you say, Damon answered. I will give you some of my blood. That will restore not only the strength you lost from giving me your blood, but grant you far more. Christian will feel light as a feather in your arms.
That's fantastic.
But Julian knew there had to be a catch. Damon had already told him that his blood was toxic to humans. How toxic? Those lips pressed together again. It will give you not only the strength to get Christian from here, but will show you the vampire world as well once you return to your world.
You mean there's a world other than here? Than the Everdark?
In a way. In your world, there are areas that only vampires can access. Humans are blind to these places, even though they are out in the open. But you will be able to see the runes that hide them, Damon explained. You will know them when you see them.
Okay, so I'll be able to find the vampires. Good. That's really good.
Julian answered, realizing that this sounded insane. But he had to save Christian. Yet would he be saving his friend by turning him into a vampire without his consent?
So how long do I have before Christian?
He couldn't say the words. 2 rotations of your world. But that will not matter. Damon answered.
Of course it matters. I mean...
You will not last that long. Damon's tone was final.
Oh.
If you do not take my blood, you will recover in a few days, Julian, Damon explained. But Christian will die. But if you take my blood, you will die, unless you are extraordinarily different from everyone before you. You will not survive. The reality is that you will fall into darkness as they did.
I understand. I'm not that special or lucky.
Julian was able to form a faint smile.
You already know that I'm going to choose to drink your blood. Take comfort in that.
I am not comforted, Damon admitted, and there was true sadness in those words. He stroked a hand over Julian's cheek and into his hair. It was the barest brush of fingers, an almost caress, and then it was gone. You are brave and beautiful,
I am sorry for your fall into darkness. I would have liked more time with you.
Me too.
Julian answered him with a broken laugh.
But I wouldn't survive losing Christian anyways, so there's no other choice, you know? I brought him here. I have to save him.
Damon said nothing. He slid the robe back from his left wrist. He then brought that wrist up to his mouth. Those plush lips finally parted, and Julian saw the fangs. They looked sharper than razors. Damon bit into his wrist, and when he drew his mouth away, rich red blood was on his lips, staining them a deeper pink. More red dripped along his opened wrist. He lowered that wrist to Julian's lips. "Drink of my blood, Julian," Damon intoned. "Receive my blessing and my curse." Join us next time for Episode 5, Abandoned.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Everdark with its professional cast and production. Having her Grace Reed studio bring this story to life is a dream come true for me. If you love and want to support this podcast, all 15 episodes of the first volume are available as an audiobook for you to download and listen to without having to be online. You can also sign up as a Wraith Reign member, which is my own website, and not only get the entire 15 volumes to stream from the private members podcast feed, but access to everything I write, including the completed Everdark and the sequel, Everdark Academy. Please see the show notes to find the links.
The Everdark podcast by Ex Aritare is performed by Edward Fox, Adam Riley, Jay Thellis, Bruno Devant, Kelly Michaels, and Hannah Hart. Edited by Matthew Prince. Continuity by Adrielle Wiggins. Everdark is produced by Wraith Reign Publishing in association with Her Grace Reads Studios. Copyright 2022 by Wraith Reign Publishing.